Ding Dong. My sometime friend Belacqua enlivened the last phase of his solipsism before he towed the line and began to relish the world, with the belief that the best thing he had to do was to move constantly from place to place. He did not know how this conclusion had been gained, but that it was not thanks to his preferring one place to another, he felt sure. He was pleased to think that he could give what he called the Furies the slip by merely setting himself in motion. But as for sights, one was as good as another, because they all disappeared as soon as he came to rest in them. The mere act of rising and going, irrespective of whence and whither, did him good. That was so. He was sorry that he did not enjoy the means to indulge this humour as he would have wished on a large scale, on land and sea. Hither and thither on land and sea. He could not afford that, for he was poor. But in a small way he did what he could. From the ingle to the window, from the nursery to the bedroom, even from one quarter of the town to another and back, these little acts of motion he was in a fair way of making, and they certainly did do him some good, as a rule. It was the old story of the salad days, torment in the terms and in the intervals, a measure of ease. Being by nature, however, sinfully indolent, bogged in indolence, asking nothing better than to stay put at the good pleasure of what he called the Furies, he was at times tempted to wonder whether the remedy were not rather more disagreeable than the complaint. But he could only suppose that it was not, seeing that he continued to have recourse to it. In a small way, it is true, but nevertheless for years he continued to have recourse to it, and to return thanks for the little good it did him. The simplest form of this exercise was boomerang, out and back. Nay, it was the only one that he could afford for many years. Thus it is clear that his contrivance did not proceed from any discrimination between different points in space, since he returned directly, if we except an occasional pause for refreshment, to his point of departure, and truly no less recruited in spirit than if the interval had been whiled away abroad in the most highly reputed cities. I know all this because he told me. We were Pylades and Orestes for a period, flattened down to something very genteel, but the relation abode, and was highly confidential while it lasted. I have witnessed every stage of the exercise. I have been there when he set out, springing up and hastening away without as much as by your leave, impelled by some force that he did not care to gainsay. I have had glimpses of him enjoying his little trajectory. I have been there again when he returned, transfigured and transformed. It was very nearly the reverse of the author of the imitations, glad going out and sad coming in. He was at pains to make it clear to me, and to all those to whom he exposed his maneuver, that it was in no way cognate with the popular act of brute labour, digging and such like, exploited to disperse the dumps, an antidote depending for its efficaciousness on mere physical exhaustion, and for which he expressed the greatest contempt. He did not fatigue himself, he said. On the contrary. He lived in a Beethoven pause, he said, whatever he meant by that. In his anxiety to explain himself, he was liable to come to grief. Nay, this anxiety in itself, or so at least it seemed to me, constituted a breakdown in the self-sufficiency which he never wearied of arrogating to himself, a sorry collapse of my little internus homo, and alone sufficient to give him away as inept ape of his own shadow. But he wriggled out of everything by pleading that he had been drunk at the time, or that he was an incoherent person, and content to remain so, and so on. He was an impossible person in the end. I gave him up in the end because he was not serious. One day, in a positive gazer of confidence, he gave me an account of one of these moving pauses. He had a strong weakness for oxymoron. In the same way, he overindulged in gin and tonic water. Not the least charm of this pure blank movement, this gress or gression, was its aptness to receive, with or without the approval of the subject, in all their integrity, the faint inscriptions of the outer world. Exempt from destination, it had not to shun the unforeseen, nor turn aside from the agreeable odds and ends of the vaudeville that are liable to crop up. The sensitiveness was not the least charm of this roaming that began by being blank, nor the least charm of this pure act, the alacrity with which it welcomed defilement. But very nearly the least. Emerging, on the particular evening in question, from the underground convenience in the maw of College Street, with the vague impression that he had come from following the sunset up the Liffey till all the colour had been harried from the sky, all the tulips and erugo expunged, he squatted, not that he had too much drink taken, but simply that for the moment there were no grounds for his favouring one direction rather than another, against Tommy Moore's plinth. Yet he durst not dally. Was it not from brooding shall I, dilly-dally, that he had come out? Now the summons to move on was a subpoena. Yet he found he could not, any more than Buridan's ass, move to right or left, backward or forward. Why this was he could not make out at all, nor was it the moment of self-examination. He had experienced little or no trouble coming back from the Park Gate along the North Quay. He had taken the bridge and Westmoreland Street in his stride, and now he suddenly found himself good for nothing but to loll against the plinth of this bull-necked bard, and wait for a sign. There were signs on all hands. There was the big Bovril sign to begin with, flaring beyond the green. But it was useless. Faith, hope, and, what was it? Love. Eden missed, every ebb derided, all the tides ebbing from the shingle of ego maximus, little me. Itself it went nowhere, only round and round, like the spheres, but mutely. It could not dislodge him now, it could only put ideas into his head. Was it not from sitting still among his ideas, other people's ideas, that he had come away? What would he not give now to get on the move again, away from ideas? Turning aside from this and other no less futile emblems, his attention was arrested by a wheelchair being pushed rapidly under the arcade of the bank, in the direction of Dame Street. It moved in and out of sight behind the bars of the columns. This was the blind paralytic who sat all day near to the corner of Fleet Street, and in bad weather under the shelter of the arcade, the same being wheeled home to his home in the Coombe. It was past his time, and there was a bitter look on his face. He would give his chairman a piece of mind when he got him to himself. This chairman, hireling or poor relation, came every evening a little before the dark, unfastened from the beggar's neck and breast the placard announcing his distress, tucked him up snugly in his coverings, and wheeled him home to his supper. He was well advised to be assiduous, for this beggar was a power in the Coombe. In the morning it was his duty to shave his man and wheel him, according to the weather, to one or other of his pitches. So it went day after day. This was a star the horizon adorning, if you like, and Belacqua made off at all speed in the opposite direction. Down Pearse Street, that is to say, long, straight Pearse Street, its vast barrack of Glencullen granite, its home of tragedy restored and enlarged, its coal merchants and Florentine fire brigade station, its 2 servy saloons, ice cream and fried fish, its dairies, garages, and monumental sculptors, and, implicit behind the whole length of its southern frontage, the college. Perpetuus futurus temporibus duraturum. It was to be hoped so, indeed. It was a most pleasant street, despite its name, to be abroad in, full as it always was, with shabby substance and honest-to-God coming and going. All day the roadway was a tumult of buses, red and blue and silver. By one of these a little girl was run down, just as Belacqua drew near to the railway viaduct. She had been to the Hibernian dairies for milk and bread, and then she had plunged out into the roadway. She was in such a childish fever to get back, in record time, with her treasure, to the tenement in Mark Street where she lived. The good milk was all over the road, and the loaf, which had sustained no injury, was sitting up against the curb, for all the world as though a pair of hands had taken it up and set it down there. The queue standing for the Palace Cinema was torn between conflicting desires, to keep their places and to see the excitement. They craned their necks and called out to know the worst, but they stood firm. Only one girl, debauched in appearance and swathed in a black blanket, fell out near the sting of the queue and secured the loaf. With the loaf under her blanket, she sidled unchallenged down Mark Street and turned into Mark Lane. When she got back to the queue, her place had been taken, of course. But her sally had not cost her more than a couple of yards. Belacqua turned left into Lombard Street, the street of the sanitary engineers, and entered a public house. Here he was known, in the sense that his grotesque exterior had long ceased to alienate the curates and make them giggle, and to the extent that he was served with his drink without having to call for it. This did not always seem a privilege. He was tolerated, what was more, and let alone by the rough but kindly habitués of the house, recruited for the most part from among dockers, railwaymen, and vague joxers on the dole. Here also art and love, scrabbling in dispute or staggering home, were barred, or perhaps better, unknown. The aesthetes and the impotent were far away. These circumstances combined to make of this place a very grateful refuge for Belacqua, who never omitted, when he found himself in its neighborhood with the price of a drink about him, to pay it a visit. When I inquired how he squared such visits, with his anxiety to keep on the move, and his distress at finding himself brought to a standstill, as when he had come out of the underground in the mouth of College Street, he replied that he did not. "Surely," he said, "my resolution has the right to break down." I supposed so indeed. "Or," he said, "if you prefer, I make the raid in 2 hops instead of non-stop." "From what," he cried, "does that disqualify me? I should very much like to know." I hastened to assure him that he had a perfect right to suit himself in what, after all, was a maneuver of his own contriving, and that the raid, to adopt his own term, lost nothing by being made in easy stages. "Easy!" he exclaimed. "How easy?" But notice the double response, like 2 holes to a burrow. Sitting in this crapulent den, drinking his drink, he gradually ceased to see its furnishings with pleasure, the bottles representing centuries of loving research, the stools, the counter, the powerful screws, the shining phalanx of the pulls and the beer engines, all cunningly devised and elaborated to further the relations between purveyor and consumer in this domain. The bottles drawn and emptied in a twinkling, the casks responding to the slightest pressure on their joysticks, the weary proletarians at rest on arse and elbow. The cash register that never complains. The graceful curates flying from customer to customer, all this made up a spectacle in which Belacqua was used to take delight, and chose to see a pleasant instance of machinery decently subservient to appetite. A great major symphony of supply and demand, effect and cause, fulcrate on the middle C of the counter and waxing, as it proceeded, in the charming harmonics of blasphemy and broken glass, and all the aliquots of fatigue and ebriety. So that he would say that the only place where he could come to anchor and be happy was a low public house, and that all the wearisome tactics of Gress and Dud Beethoven would be done away with if only he could spend his life in such a place. But they closed at 10, and as residence and good faith were viewed as incompatible, and as in any case he had not the means to consecrate his life to stasis, even in the meanest bar, he supposed he must be content to indulge this whim from time to time, and return thanks for such sporadic mercy. All this, and much more, he labored to make clear. He seemed to derive considerable satisfaction from his failure to do so. But on this particular occasion, the cat failed to jump, with the result that he became as despondent as though he were sitting at home in his own great armchair, as anxious to get on the move, and quite as hard put to it to do so. Why this was, he could not make out. Whether the trituration of the child in Purse Street had upset him without his knowing it, or whether, and he put forward this alternative with a truly insufferable complacency, he had come to some parting of the ways, he did not know at all. All he could say was that the objects in which he was used to find such recreation and repose lost gradually their hold upon him. He became insensible to them little by little. The old itch and algos crept back into his mind. He had come briskly all the way from Tommymore, and now he suddenly found himself sitting paralyzed and grieving, in a pub of all places, good for nothing but to stare at his spoiling porter, and wait for a sign. To this day he does not know what caused him to look up, but look up he did. Feeling the impulse to do this strong upon him, he forced his eyes away from the glass of dying porter, and was rewarded by seeing a hatless woman advancing slowly towards him up the body of the bar. No sooner had she come in than he must have been aware of her. That was surely very curious, in the first instance. She seemed to be hawking some ware or other, but what it was he could not see, except that it was not studs or laces or matches or lavender or any of the usual articles. Not that it was unusual to find a woman in that public house, for they came and went freely, slaking their thirst and beguiling their sorrows, with no less freedom than their menfolk. Indeed, it was always a pleasure to see them. Their advances were always more friendly and honourable. Belacqua had many a delightful recollection of their commerce. Hence there was no earthly reason why he should see in the advancing figure of this mysterious peddler anything untoward, or in the nature of the sign default of which he was clamped to his stool till closing time. Yet the impulse to do so was so strong that he yielded to it, and as she drew nearer, having met with more rebuffs than pence in her endeavours to dispose of her wares, whatever they were, it became clear to him that his instinct had not played him false, in so far at least as she was a woman of very remarkable presence indeed. Her speech was that of a woman of the people, but of a gentlewoman of the people. Her gown had served its time, but yet contrived to be respectable. He noticed with a pang that she sported about her neck the insidious little mock fur so prevalent in Tony slumland. The one deplorable feature of her get-up, as apprehended by Belacqua in his hasty survey, was the footwear, the cruel straight outsizes of the suffragette or welfare worker. But he did not doubt for a moment that they had been a gift, or picked up in the pop for a song. She was of more than average height, and well in flesh. She might be past middle age. But her face, her face, was what Belacqua had rather refer to as her countenance. It was so full of light. This she lifted up upon him, and no error. Brimful of light and serene, serenissime, it bore no trace of suffering, and in this alone it might be said to be a notable face. Yet like tormented faces that he had seen, like the face in the National Gallery in Merrion Square, by the master of tired eyes, it seemed to have come a long way, and subtend an infinitely narrow angle of affliction, as eyes focus a star. The features were null, only luminous, impassive, and secure, petrified in radiance, or words to that effect. For the reader is requested to take notice that this sweet style is Belacqua's. An act of expression, he said, a wreathing or wrinkling, could only have had the effect of a dimmer on a headlight. The implications of this triumphant figure, the just and the unjust, etc., are better foregone. At long last she addressed herself to Belacqua. "Seats in heaven," she said, in a white voice. "Twopence apiece, 4 for a tanner." "No," said Belacqua. It was the first syllable to come to his lips. It had not been his intention to deny her. "The best of seats," she said. "Again I'm sold out. Twopence apiece, the best of seats, 4 for a tanner." This was unforeseen with a vengeance, if not exactly vaudeville. Belacqua was embarrassed in the last degree, but transported also. He felt the sweat coming in the small of his back, above his Montrouge belt. "Have you got them on you?" he mumbled. "Heaven goes round," she said, whirling her arm, "and round and round, and round and round and round." "Yes," said Belacqua, "round and round." "Rowan," she said, dropping the D's and getting more of a spin into the slogan. "Rowan and Rowan and Rowan." Belacqua scarcely knew where to look. Unable to blush, he came out in this beastly sweat. Nothing of the kind had ever happened to him before. He was altogether disarmed, unsaddled, and miserable. The eyes of them all, the dockers, the railwaymen, and, most terrible of all, the joxers were upon him. His tail drooped. This female dog of a pixie, with her tiresome Ptolemy, he was at her mercy. "No," he said. "No, thank you. No, not this evening, thank you." "Again I'm sold out," she said. "I'm booked out, 4 for a tanner." "On whose authority—" began Belacqua, like a scholar. "For your friend," she said. "Your da, your ma, and your marta, 4 for a tanner." The voice ceased, but the face did not abate. "How do I know," piped Belacqua, "you're not selling me a pup?" "Heaven goes rowan and rowan." "Rot you," said Belacqua. "I'll take 2. How much is that?" 4d, she said. Belacqua gave her a sixpence. "God bless your honour," she said, in the same white voice from which she had not departed. She made to go. "Here," cried Belacqua, "you owe me 2pence." He had not even the good grace to say 2pence. "Ragawan," she said, "make it 4 cancher. Your friend, your da, your man, your marta." Belacqua could not bicker. He had not the strength of mind for that. He turned away. "Jesus," she said distinctly, "and his sweet mother preserve your honour." "Amen," said Belacqua, into his dead porter. Now the woman went away, and her countenance lighted her to her room in Townsend Street. But Belacqua tarried a little to listen to the music. Then he also departed, but for Railway Street, beyond the river.